And assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Whatever it is, you try and channel it.
You will see a procession of deny what they think is false, argue what they think is false. Free and uncorrupted communication.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. It was nice to hear how many astronomy groups are here. I hope you learned something new. It's really a great time for planets. How many planets? 9? Do I hear 10? 8? 200? Well, you see, this is really great because for so long there didn't need to be a definition. The word just means wanderers, and even the sun and the moon were lumped in that category. But now we need to have a way to determine whether Pluto is a planet or not, for one thing. That was the most frequently asked question I had while I was working on this book. Do you include Pluto? The second, actually there were only 2 questions. And the second question was, do you listen to Holst while you're working? No. But I had a great good time working on this book. It's been a long time coming because there are a couple of obvious problems in trying to write a book about the planets. In the first place, there are many already. So if you are knowledgeable and looking for a good book to read, you have lots and lots of choices. But I was hoping to write a book for people who were not knowledgeable. And I specifically had my agent in mind. Because, I may be the only writer in America who can say, I love my agent. And one day he asked me, what is the difference between the solar system and the galaxy, and between the galaxy and the universe? I thought, now here is this person who is extremely well-educated, highly intelligent, extremely successful in business, happily adjusted. He has no clue what's up there. It's just a big blur. And then he said, write a book for me that will speak to me at my level, because I want to know these things, but don't assume any prior knowledge. So that was the challenge, and I find it very helpful to have a person that I'm talking to, because it's very hard to write for the general public. Who is that? So this book was really for him. Then, of course, there's the problem of the lack of storyline, because some of the planets have been known since ancient times, some are fairly recent discoveries, and so by the same token there's no designated hero that carries the whole story. So it took me about a year of walking around to come up with a way around those problems. And I thought of using all the ways that people already know the planets, because we come across them in the days of the week, in mythology, science fiction, astrology. We're in California, so I can talk about astrology. And I realized that each of those topics had more to do with a particular planet than with others. And so I've linked them all up that way. And, well, let me read you a little bit, and you'll see what I mean. I think I will start with the chapter on the moon, because the moon is about lunacy. And everybody knows what happens under a full moon. Not really. I mean, it's just what people say happens. But there is this expectation of mayhem. And this story that you're going to hear at the beginning of this chapter is a true story. During the glory days of the Apollo project, a young astronomer who analyzed moon rocks at a university laboratory fell in love with my friend Carolyn and risked his job and the national security to give her a quantum of moon dust. "Where is it? Let me see," I demanded at this news, but she answered quietly, "I ate it." After a pause, she added, "There was so little," as though that explained everything. I was furious. In an instant, I had dropped from the giddy height of discovering the moon right there in Carolyn's apartment to realizing she had eaten it all without leaving a crumb for me. In a reverie, I saw the moon dust caress Carolyn's lips like a lover's kiss. As it entered her mouth, it ignited on contact with her saliva to shoot sparks that lodged in her every cell. Crystalline and alien, it illuminated her body's dark recesses like pixie powder, thrumming the senseless tune of a wind chime through her veins. By its sacred presence, it changed her very nature. Carolyn, the moon goddess. She had mated herself to the moon somehow via this act of incorporation, and that was what made me so jealous. Of course, I had heard the old wives' tales advising women to open their bedroom curtains and sleep in the moonlight for heightened fertility or a more regular menstrual cycle, but no folklore described powers to be won from the moon by eating its dust. Carolyn's deed conjured space-age magic, undreamed of when her mother and mine were new wives. I still envy Carolyn her taste of the moon. In reality, I know she is married now to a veterinarian in upstate New York and has 3 grown children. She doesn't glow in the dark or walk on air. She has long since lost all traces of that moon morsel, which no doubt passed through her body in the usual way. What could it have contained anyway to preoccupy me all these years? A few grains of titanium and aluminum? Some helium atoms born from the sun on the solar wind? The shining essence of all that is unattainable? All of the above, probably. All rendered the more extraordinary for having traveled to her across 240,000 miles of interplanetary space in the belly of a rocket ship and hand-delivered as the love token of a handsome man. Lucky, lucky Carolyn. The Apollo astronauts themselves did not intentionally swallow any moon dust, though it clung to them, covered their white boots and spacesuits with grime, and so climbed with them back into their lunar modules. The moment they removed their bubble helmets, a smell of spent gunpowder or of wet ashes in a fireplace assailed them. It was the moon dust, tamely burning in the oxygen atmosphere the men had carried from home. Outside, on the airless lunar surface, did the trodden dust give off any odor of its own? Does a tree falling in a forest make a sound if no one hears? The astronauts judged the dusty surface of the moon a shade of tan, like beach sand, when they looked at it facing sunward, but said it turned gray when they turned the other way, and black when they scooped dust samples into plastic bags. The unearthly glare of unfiltered sunlight bedeviled their color and depth perception, and that of their photographic film as well. Similarly attuned to the light of Earth's atmosphere, the film formed its own interpretation of the new landscape's subtle hues and stark relief, so that, in the end, the men's pictures betrayed their color memories of walking on the moon. I think I'll stop there. So each planet, each body gets its own association. And I worked with a space artist on this book. She actually lives in San Francisco. Those of you who read astronomy or Sky and Telescope are probably familiar with her work. Her name is Lynette Cook. And she helped me merge the planets with the themes. And those are the images I'd like to show you tonight. And I think I will do that now before we do anything else. That's not one of them. There we go. So these are her paintings of the original 9. We'll talk about what the correct census should be later. Although I must report that in New York at what was the Hayden Planetarium when I was a child, it's now the Rose Center for Earth and Space, Pluto is out. They've already dropped it. So her paintings can be very realistic looking, as you see. She often works from spacecraft images, Hubble images, but she also has worked a lot from the imagination. And she has helped the discoverers of the extrasolar planets, of which nearly 200 are now known, all having been discovered within the past 10 years. And she talks to those discoverers about the bodies they have found and what the conditions there are probably like, and then she paints the planet for them. And this image, the Saturn part of it and the star field, is actually printed on the hard case of the book, and then there's a paper dust jacket over that that has Tycho's system of the cosmos. So in the first chapter, I talked about how I became planet crazed as a child. I think a lot of children love planets. Some children love bugs, some love dinosaurs, some all three. But I was a planet child, and I built one of these dioramas in a shoebox for the science fair. Of course, in the 1950s, the solar system was a much simpler place. There were very few moons. It was not a very difficult assignment. And she's tried to make this look crude and childlike, but she's way ahead of my artistic ability, I assure you. And what I love about this, of course, the child building this particular diorama is not on the Earth, but somewhere else. The chapter about the sun uses the language of Genesis as its basis. So we created a little planetary Garden of Eden here. And you see in the topiary the planets are taking shape as they did in the early nebula. We had a great deal of fun doing these, as I'm sure you'll see. And the sundial is actually the face of the sun with the sunspots. Sunspots and the grainy-looking texture of the photosphere, the visible surface of the sun. And then the flowers are actually photographs worked in. And then up at the top, the stages of a total solar eclipse leading up to totality and the beautiful corona bursting into view. And Mercury is all about mythology because there's been more mention of Mercury in the myths than there is of any other god. And it's interesting how the planet and the god are similar to each other, because the god Mercury was very speedy, he was the messenger, and of course the planet, being closest to the sun, is the fastest orbiter of them all. And this moon-like looking body up here is Mercury. And then he was the go-between between the worlds of the living and the dead, and the one who conducted the souls of the dead down to Hades. So the world of the living, the world of the dead, the weight of the soul. That's actually a real feather just put on a scanner. And then the Grecian urn here has the iconography. Mercury stole the cattle from Apollo on the first day of his life, and he created the lyre out of a tortoise shell, thereby creating music and the wings and his caduceus. The Venus chapter was the hardest one for her to render visually because it's all about poetry. Amazing how many poets actually wrote poems about Venus, including Wordsworth, Tennyson, Robert Frost, The Literate Farmer and the Planet Venus. And poetry is a great vehicle with which to talk about beauty. So a familiar symbol of beauty there. Up here, the planet Venus is shown in its various phases, which you could see if you were looking at it through a telescope, because it's when it's close and very bright, it's actually in a partial phase. But most people see it like this, just with the naked eye, dazzlingly bright as it is tonight, and often in a lovely grouping with the moon. And it is the brightest object after the sun and the moon, and therefore the object most frequently mistaken for a UFO. And if that top image was a window shade, this is the pull. And this little sphere here is the planet Venus, the way it looks shrouded in its dense acidic clouds, which have kept astronomers from seeing the surface. The only time the surface was seen was when some Russian spacecraft landed briefly and lasted barely an hour before the terrible heat and pressure on Mercury just crushed it and melted it. But this spacecraft, this is the Magellan spacecraft that orbited the planet and mapped the entire surface by radar. And that revealed hundreds of thousands of surface features that now had to be named. And so, since the planet had this long association with femininity, the International Astronomical Union ruled that all the features on Venus had to be named on an all-female naming scheme. And there are categories. There are goddesses of love for the big land areas, then goddesses of the hearth, of the hunt, famous women in history. I'm happy to say there is a crater named for Galileo's daughter. That was very nice. And they're all female. The Earth chapter is about the discovery of the Earth as a planet, because for a long, long time it was thought to be just the unheavenly and rather boring center of the universe. Not the center of the universe as a privileged place, but as the sink where all the rocky, non-celestial bits just came to rest. So there's a lot in here about voyages of discovery to find out what was on the far side of the world. This is Ptolemy's map of the known world up here. Columbus's ships. And then the realization that the Earth was actually orbiting the sun, taking its place as a wanderer. And now the voyage in to determine what is inside the planet. And this image was made before the tsunamis of last December, but just happens to be that troubled region of the plate map that's in view here. Now I've told you a little bit about the moon craziness, so here under the full moon. Beautiful light and dust. The moon's light is so bright that you can actually read by it, and yet it is so much dimmer than the sun's light that you don't really have color vision. And that's one of the things that makes moonlight make everything around you look so unusual. Here up in this gazebo we have the Apollo lunar module, and then the phases of the moon around here. And at the bottom, a moon garden. Now, if you want to plant a moon garden, you need all white flowers, or flowers that bloom after dark, like these flowers. This is angel's trumpet. And this is a Luna moth. Lynette used to do a lot of botanical illustration before she became a space artist. Guess which planet? Here we are at Mars, having some kind of hostile invasion. Actually, the Mars chapter, which is about science fiction, is very much about this rock, ALH 84001. 84001, yes, which captured a lot of headlines in 1996 for not just being proven of Martian origin, but of seeming to have within it signs that something had lived inside it. And we really do look at Mars through life-colored glasses. This has ever been true. And probably we'll have to go live on Mars ourselves after we complete the destruction of this planet. And it's probably the only place that would have us. Here we see a lot of material that's been knocked off the surface of Mars by an impact, and it's just drifting in space. That's the Earth off in the distance there. And the amazing thing is that this actually happens, and pieces of the terrestrial planets actually get exchanged among the planets. So it is possible to find pieces of Mars, pieces of the Moon on the Earth without having to have sent astronauts to collect them and carry them home. This is the view of Mars that Percival Lowell made popular, a very regularly engineered surface full of canals that the dying race of intelligent creatures is using to husband the scarce water. And this is the Mars that is becoming more and more familiar today, thanks to the rover craft that are there and other missions that are showing that Mars was a very wet place at one time, and that the water is probably still there. It's frozen, it's underground, but it's there. Little artistic license up close on the rock here, these little wormy-looking things. The Jupiter chapter is about astrology, and I took a big risk here because as a science writer, I'm really not allowed to talk about astrology. I'm supposed to say that this is just a load of nonsense, and if you want to know your real place in the universe, then you should study astronomy, which is true. However, it's also true that a lot of people are very interested in astrology. How many of you know your sign? Thank you. Okay. So, and people know about the planets from astrology too, because there's always some planet that figures in the chart. So to get the flavor of the thing here, I actually consulted an astrologer, and I was quite impressed at how seriously she worked, how much information she brought to our conversation. Unfortunately, she told me that I had been on a cycle of great creativity for 30 years, and that now this cycle was coming to an end, which was not what I needed to hear at the beginning of a new... But then I reminded myself that I didn't really believe in this, which carried me on. But when Galileo discovered the 4 largest satellites of Jupiter, which are shown here and here, he interpreted their astrological significance for the Medici family, which is how he got himself a lifetime position in the court. And he was quite familiar with astrology, had done his own natal chart, which I gave to the astrologer to interpret. And that was all very interesting too. This is the Galileo spacecraft, which was intentionally destroyed about 2 years ago because of its own success. One of the discoveries it made was of a vast saltwater ocean on the moon Europa. So NASA got very nervous. What if we leave this a derelict in space and someday it just blunders into Europa and kills some life coming to be, or pollutes an otherwise pristine environment? So on the safe assumption that there's no life on Jupiter, they just directed the spacecraft to crash into Jupiter and destroy itself. This is a comet shown being captured by Jupiter and heading for the clouds where there is known to be lightning. In 1994, there was a spectacular comet crash on Jupiter, a comet that had been captured earlier and broken into many pieces, and then one by one they all descended and shot up great plumes of debris. You saw scientists on television drinking champagne, and it was very, very exciting. I asked the astrologer to do a chart for the Galileo spacecraft. Turns out you can make a horoscope for an inanimate object, and we used the date of its launch as the birth date. And for those of you who remember, this spacecraft ran into a lot of trouble. It was supposed to be launched from the space shuttle, and because of the Challenger disaster, the launch was delayed. And no one realized that the spacecraft had been injured during the delay. And it wasn't until it was on its way to Jupiter and tried to open its antenna that people realized the antenna was jammed and that was not going to open all the way. And some frantic reprogramming, refiguring went on at a great distance to work around this problem. Also, there was an onboard tape recorder that was supposed to store up data until an opportune moment for a transmission to Earth, and the tape recorder kept jamming. Now, if you look at this horoscope, you see this little square? A square is very bad in astrology. And the square aspect is between Jupiter, the partner in life of this spacecraft, and Mercury, the planet of communication. I just put that out there for you to think about. It's very interesting. I meant to point out the moons, but I think I already did. Okay. Saturn is about the music of the spheres, which is an ancient concept. From earliest times, there was an idea that the planets were spaced at distances that related to the same rules that created the steps on a musical scale, and that there was a cosmic harmony that was actually musical. And scientists repeated that theme throughout history. Of course, Holst wrote his suite for the planets, which had only 7 movements because Pluto hadn't been discovered when he wrote the music, and he didn't write a piece for Earth. But Saturn was his favorite. He was on record as saying that that was his personal favorite. So this wallpaper here is the actual score from the Saturn movement. When Kepler picked up the music idea, he felt that each planet had a couple of notes, and it would literally change its tune as it approached the sun and receded from the sun in the course of its orbit. So there would be this actual singing that only God could hear. And this is the Saturn tune that Kepler derived. And this is the Huygens probe parachuting down into the clouds of Titan, the largest moon of Saturn. This really happened last year. It was all very exciting. Well, actually the beginning of this year. And the beautiful rings of Saturn, which are the lure, the reason that many astronomers actually became astronomers, because somebody showed them Saturn through a telescope, and they were instantly intoxicated. But the rings have these interesting patterns, gaps in them that appear, and the gaps turn out to be resonant relationships with the moons that orbit exterior to the rings and even inside the rings, so that there's something musical there too. On the tile floor here, this is the Cassini spacecraft, these big white ones with its antenna, and then in between these little triangular elements, that is the Huygens probe as it might have looked coming. If you were standing on the surface of Titan when that came down, that's something like what you would have seen. Uranus and Neptune are about discovery because they were the first planets to be discovered. The others had just been known since ancient time. And I had the idea to tell this chapter from the perspective of Caroline Herschel, because her brother, William, discovered Uranus in 1781. She was his right arm at that time. And then she was still alive 60 years later when Neptune was discovered. And right around the time of Neptune's discovery, the young American astronomer Maria Mitchell had discovered a comet. And Caroline Herschel had discovered several comets in her lifetime. So here were these only 2 women in the world who had discovered a comet. What if Caroline wrote to Maria to congratulate her and reminisced about her life, because she was almost 98, and told this story? So I did that in the book. And one of the early reviews said that the material was all original, except for a long verbatim letter from Caroline. So I don't know, I guess that's a compliment. Here is a picture of a comet in a cracked frame, because when Herschel discovered Uranus, nobody was expecting anyone to find any more planets. In fact, some people thought there couldn't be any more than there were. So it was first assumed to be a comet, but it did not behave like one, so eventually people had to admit it was a planet. This is the way Uranus looked to the Voyager 2 spacecraft, a bland, boring blob. But all of that is changing now. Things on Uranus are heating up, the season is changing, and it's starting to look as full of weather as Neptune. You can see these reddish rings here. The rings aren't really red, but they're just colored that way in this image. And they're turning. When the rings were discovered, the planet was facing Earth like a bullseye target. And that's how the rings were discovered, because astronomers were trying to watch the planet as it passed in front of a star. And instead of seeing the star be obliterated by the planet, there were these little interruptions, one after another. And then the planet passed in front of the star, and then a lot of other little blinkings on and off. And they realized that there were probably rings around Uranus too. The Pluto chapter is about UFOs, because Pluto is a UFO. I mean, what is it really? Is it a planet? Isn't it? It's a worry these days. And it's also about, the chapter is also about immigration, about people and things coming to a new place and being welcomed there, but then later having their citizenship questioned. Which is why Ellis Island is pictured in this image. This is Pluto and Charon, its moon, as best as they can be seen, imagined now, because Pluto is the only planet that has not ever been visited by any spacecraft. But that is about to change, because a craft is at the ready and will be launched in January to Pluto. The water coming in here is symbolic of the ocean of deep space, knowledge entering. These are other things that have been found. This is Sedna, and then various sorts of worlds that planet hunters are hoping to find, little pretty blue-green worlds that might have water and life. And this is Pluto the cat. This cat actually belonged to Clyde Tombaugh, the discoverer of Pluto. After he discovered the planet, he named his cat Pluto. And the shape of this window is the shape of the small observatory at the Lowell Observatory through which the planet was discovered. Then a little surrealism here with the planets growing on trees, being familiar objects that one could actually trip over, and to just have them feel familiar, which is what I am hoping will happen. I'm going to leave that image up, but that is the last one. And then I'd like to read you another little bit, and then maybe we could have some questions. I think I'll read from the sci-fi chapter about Mars. Call me It, or call me Alan Hills 84001, my given name. Even Thing from Mars will suit. Although I am only a rock and cannot answer, allow me this conceit of conscious identity for the space of these few pages, that I may speak for Mars, whence I traveled via chance and the laws of physics. Of the 28 Martian meteorites definitively identified to date, I am by far the most ancient, and the only one to show, under microscopic examination, internal shapes and residues similar to those formed by primitive terrestrial bacteria. These findings have made me the most studied rock of all time. One might surmise I had been contaminated by Earth life during the 13,000 years I lay in the Antarctic ice fields before scientists collected me there in 1984. The scientists certainly assumed contamination. until they ruled out the possibility, concluding in near disbelief that it was more likely I had once sheltered small beings on my home planet, creatures perhaps already extinct, when an asteroid impact flung me from the Martian surface 16 million years ago. My story, consonant with the history of Mars in human regard, seems riveted on Martian life, despite my vagueness on this subject. I have little to say of fossil life, and even less to contribute to conjecture about life on Mars today. Therefore, I make no bold claims, lest I be lumped in the company of such fiercely imagined aliens as the giant sandworms of Arrakis, or the wild thoats, green men, and great white apes of Barzoom. My Martian origin, however, I state as indisputable. My constitution mirrors the chemical makeup of rocks and dust examined in situ on the planet's surface and from close orbit by visiting spacecraft. Traces of gases trapped in glassy bubbles within my matrix exactly match the sampled atmosphere of Mars, element for element, and in the same relative abundance of rare isotopes. My foreign nature could never have been proven before the current age of spacefaring, and yet I came to Earth without benefit of any artificial conveyance. The collision that launched my journey dug a hole in Mars several miles wide. Astronomers think they have identified that particular crater on satellite images of Mars near a small valley in the southern highlands. The violence of the impact lofted tons of crustal rock into the sparse atmosphere at high speed, and all the fastest moving pieces, the ones accelerated past the local escape velocity of 3 miles per second, hastened out of the planet's grip forever. As a Martian from a heavily cratered region, I was acquainted with meteorite strikes, and in fact already bore a fracture scar from having been crushed and reheated in a previous impact. But now I found myself become a meteorite, or more correctly, a meteoroid. That is to say, a true space wanderer, loosed from one world and not yet landed at another. 16 million years of seemingly aimless rambling at length brought me close enough to Earth to be captured by its gravity, which is 3 times stronger than the pull of Mars. By long odds, I should have disappeared into an ocean, the fate of most meteorites that survive their fiery descent to Earth's surface. But instead, I fell near the South Pole during the last ice age, on a bed of frozen water. Snows came and covered me, folded me into the slowly flowing glacier, and together we crept forward for thousands of years. Not until we reached the Allen Hills and tried to climb them did the sharp cliffs and Arctic winds pluck me from the ice to leave me lying exposed again. The scientists arrived on 7 snowmobiles, in dragnet formation, hunting dark rocks on the blue-white ice, confident that all such finds would prove extraterrestrial, whether from the moon, the asteroid belt, or Mars. Even though I measure no larger than a squarish softball or a 4-pound potato, they spotted me easily by color contrast. This green rock, I appeared to them in that dazzling expanse of ice and light, only later fading to gray, dull gray, in the laboratory. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and maybe could bring up the lights. Thank you. Now it's your turn. Here comes somebody with a question. Good. I used to work on a television show where we needed call-in questions and comments, and there were some nights that you just repeated that phone number over and over.
What are the prospects of life on the moons like Europa and Titan when the sun goes red giant?
What are the prospects? You mean human life? Humans moving out there?
No, any kind of life.
Any kind of life. I don't know, and I don't know that anybody does. I would just be guessing. I mean, certainly there are hopes of finding life there. Europa, Titan, those are good candidates, at least as good as Mars. It's very cold way out there. But as you say, maybe when the sun goes red giant and there's no hope of life here anymore, maybe life will come to be and evolve there. Interesting question. Thank
How
you.
long will it have while the sun is in the red giant phase? Is it long
How
enough
long
to-
will life have to develop while the sun is in the red giant phase? A few million years, probably? Anybody want to give a better estimate than that? Good enough for tonight. And far in the future, too. Yes, right here.
Is this mic live? Yes, it is.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Your work is wonderful.
Thank you.
And we're very intrigued by your collaboration with the artist. Is there a website where we can look at these?
There will be. I'm going to interrupt you because I have been referring people to her website and just found out today that she doesn't have them on the website yet, but they are coming.
Could you talk just a bit more about the nature of the collaboration, the way you worked imaginatively with her to help her create things?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. Well, originally, of course, I hoped that these images would be in the book. That was the point. And since I had never done this kind of collaboration before, and the publisher didn't know what to expect, I commissioned one of these works to hand in with my manuscript. And Mercury seemed like the best one to start with. And I just said to her, give me Mercury on a Grecian urn. And I had no idea what it would look like. 5 minutes later, she's in San Francisco, I'm in New York. So having said this by email, I got back from her a website with the shapes of ancient Greek pottery. And she said, pick one. And it was that much back and forth. And her artistic process was fascinating to me, too. Sometimes, just by reading the chapter, she would have an idea about where to take it, and then just show me something. And I would love it or not. The Saturn image, I think, is the one that came second, and it was a violin first, which really threw me. I mean, I knew it had to be about music, but the violin, although it was beautiful. And I thought, well, Galileo played the lute, as did Huygens. So if we swap the violin for a lute, I think I could live with this. And it went like that. So the publishers took a long time to decide on whether or not they liked this idea, but then they decided they did. So we went on through the solar system and did them all, and then there was a change of editor. In publishing, we have something called editorial judgment, which some people think is an oxymoron. But the decision was to not illustrate the book. So the pictures came out, and I'm hoping they will have a new life. I was hoping they might be made into stationery. I'm always looking for good astronomy-themed stationery. There isn't much. I'm sure those of you who are fellow space cadets have been through the few available choices several times over. But we'll do something with it. We may yet see them back in the book. Sorry to keep you standing there so long.
I wonder, what if there were no other planets or moons in our solar system, so that Earth was the only substantial body orbiting the sun? Do you think that the history of our understanding of the universe would have unfolded differently, or do you think our sense of place in the universe would be different?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, I do think it would be very different, and I think our lives would have been more difficult, because one of the nice things about being in a family is that the people stand up for each other, and I think it's pretty well agreed now that without Jupiter to eject a lot of the troublesome bodies, the visiting comets, more things might have struck the Earth, and our lives, or whatever was leading up to us beforehand, could have been wiped out before we evolved. There's great migration now coming to light in the outer solar system. How did all those small bodies get out where they were? Did the giant planets actually eject things all the way out of the solar system so that they're nowhere to be seen now? It would have been very, very different.
I don't really have a question, but maybe a comment. You said you were jealous of your friend Carolyn and her lunar dust, but of course all of the heavy elements were created in supernovae explosions, and evolution tends to favor the successful, so we're all basically stardust from a long line of winners. So.
That's right. What a nice way. Thank you for that comment.
I was wondering what surprised you most about your research?
What surprised me most in my research? Probably the relationship of the sun to the rest of the solar system. I don't think I'd ever thought about how much bigger, how much more massive. But the figure 99.9% for the sun and everything else is the remainder. That's impressive.
All right. Well, I was wondering, when you talked about the rock that had blown off Mars and landed on our planet, how do they know that, like, dates from how long ago, like when it blew off the planet and how long it was on ours?
A very good question. Well, you might ask. From the geology of the rock, just the way Earth rocks can be dated by chemical tests, this rock came with its own history, and that is the best interpretation scientists have been able to make of what happened to it. It had to leave Mars at a fairly early time, and the exposure to cosmic rays in space, all sorts of things like that were taken into account to come up with that history.
So this isn't working. Oh, never mind. How long, how long do you know that it was actually on our planet rather than when it was like floating over here? And because it was the two different dates.
Right.
How do you know when it actually landed on Earth?
That was also their best guess from where it was found and its chemical history.
Will humans ever be able to set foot on Mars in this century?
Will humans be able to set foot on Mars in this century? I think so. What I worry about is that the present administration's focus on putting humans back on the moon and on Mars, that might swamp the whole space program and nothing else will get done. And that would be a shame. Do you want to go to Mars?
I don't know.
I do. I think it'd be great. But I think it's been proven that the robots get a lot more done, and cheaper too.
Thank you.
I was reminded of a phrase I learned in high school, one of the maybe few things I learned in school, which was, "My very eager mother just scorched Uncle Ned's pants."
I learned my very educated mother just served us 9 pies.
That might be better. I have about 30 questions. One was the latest thoughts on where all the water came from on planet Earth. Another one is, given the billions of galaxies, other planets with life. and other solar systems. And given what's going on at the sun, how does it last so long?
I think you better stop there. Well, one of the ideas for how water came to Earth was via comets, that there were many comets crashing into the Earth and just delivering oceans worth of water. That's one theory.
I've thought of that too, and I've heard that too from a JPL friend, and it seems like it's an awful lot of water. And number one, why weren't they crashing on all the other planets, or maybe they were?
Well, they were.
Okay.
And then your second question was about the possibility of life elsewhere.
Or in this galaxy or other
in this galaxy. Well, I had the great pleasure of working with Frank Drake on a book once. He was one of the SETI pioneers and came up with a way of thinking of the likelihood of life elsewhere, which is now called the Drake equation. And you have to think about how many stars are there, how many have planets, how many have planets that are hospitable to life. If life arises on a planet, then, as one of the previous commentators said, intelligence is a very useful thing, so that probably has a survival advantage. And it all boils down to, the whole equation comes down to one really important factor, which is, once an intelligent civilization develops technology, can they survive their own technology? And so, if they're out there and they're older than we are, we probably have a lot to learn from them, which is why they're not visiting us. I feel certain we've not been visited, but I think it makes sense to listen. That was Drake's argument, that it's very inexpensive to listen, and what if we received some radio transmission that was obviously of intelligent design? Even if we couldn't decipher it, it would still be a fascinating discovery. But now it seems, I mean, what if they have cable and nothing is leaking out? We might never know that they're there. So these are all very interesting questions. Now the sun, that was the last one. How does it? Well, that is the great abundant story, that it's been burning all these years and has a lot of life left. We have much more to worry about blowing ourselves up than having the sun go red giant while we're still around.